We are going to start with the latest headlines coming out of the U.S. Capitol as I bring you out to this, a live image of the Capitol building over in Washington, D.C. Another shutdown for parts of the federal government has begun as a fight over proposed restrictions on President Trump's immigration enforcement agenda drags on. Funding for the Department of Homeland Security expired on Saturday, and Democrats say they will not help approve more money until the new limits are placed on federal immigration operations after the fatal shooting of Alex Pretti and Renee in Minneapolis last month. Now, that reporting is courtesy of the Associated Press. The author of that report is Meg Kennard, who joined us now. Meg, good to have you.
Hey, good to be back with you.
All right, so let's just start with the basics here. What are Democrats asking for in terms of immigration enforcement to help fund the government, and how would that change things in practical terms?
There are a number of things on Democrats' wish list that they want to see happening at Department of Homeland Security before they say they're willing to approve further funding. Among those things are a code of conduct for the officers who would be on the ground in cities like Minneapolis conducting some of these enforcement actions on the immigration side that we saw playing out in recent weeks. Also, there are more specific things like requiring that agents not be able to mask themselves. That's been a big point of contention, especially in Minneapolis during the recent enforcement actions that have now just officially ended as of a couple of days ago. So those are some of the specifics, but writ large, we've heard from Democrats on Capitol Hill and across the country saying that they really want to see more accountability at Department of Homeland Security. For some, that's playing out in calls for Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem to resign. But for others, it's more of a broad critique of the leadership at the department, saying that that's what's led to some of the incidents of violence, including those shootings that you mentioned. So there's kind of a grab bag of different things the Democrats are wanting, but a lot of it boils down to those very heated confrontations that we've seen in Minneapolis.
Now, Meg, President Trump already secured tens of billions of dollars in funding for CBP and ICE operations. So what leverage do Democrats actually have at this point?
It's a really good point because you're right. As of the Tax Cuts and Jobs bill that was passed through last year, a lot of that funding is actually keeping the department going. So it's not necessarily a question of shutting down and not that meaning that agents can't be on the ground doing their work. That's already paid for. But now this maybe does create a bit of a bigger, broader moment of leverage for Democrats to be able to say, okay, well, what we're doing in terms of holding up this funding measure from passing through is not necessarily impeding the department. So now we can kind of take this. I don't want to use the word symbolic because I don't mean to imply that it's not incredibly important, but to take more of a moment to say, okay, we're not really hampering the functionality of the agency and the various work that agents are doing on the ground, but we are going to plant our flag and say that we're not going to officially approve that appropriation for the department until some of these needs that we want as Democrats are met. So it's not really something that we as Americans are seeing necessarily. The department is functioning. If this goes on, there could be more ramifications in places like airports because TSA is also part of Homeland Security. And we've seen in shutdowns past that the longer things go on, some of those workers may not show up if their paychecks aren't met. And that could be something that we as Americans are seeing. But it's kind of a broader, more holistic approach that Democrats are taking to say, this is our moment. We're not really hindering the department from doing its actual work, but we do have an opportunity to keep these things on our wish list until some of them are met.
And we're going to touch on these different departments, DHS, TSA, also FEMA, in just a bit. But first, I want to take us out to a couple of social media posts from leadership within Congress and their reaction. This post from House Speaker Mike Johnson saying, here we go again, the new Democrat shutdown, this time of the Department of Homeland Security, will hit some very important programs like FEMA, disaster response, TSA security lines, and Coast Guard operations. That means delayed disaster aid, airport chaos, and weakened law enforcement. Democrats are once again risking public safety just to stage a pointless political stunt. We also have a social media post from Hakeem Jeffries. He says this: immigration enforcement should be fair, just, and humane, not violent or brutal. ICE has gone way too far, and the American people know it. Meg, take us back a little bit, though. Why was DHS funding separated from that broader government funding package? What was the strategy behind that?
Well, as we go back, it seems like all we've talked about lately has been shutdowns. But in some of the most recent conversations between President Trump and these congressional Democratic leaders in trying to get the big shutdown that we all talked about a lot last year, in getting that through, there was an agreement to separate out some of the funding for a couple of different agencies. You remember earlier this month when we were dealing with another, thankfully very brief shutdown, that was dealing with funding for 6 different entities, DHS among them. And so there have been these kind of subsequent and incremental carve-outs for some of that funding because Democrats have been upset about it for some time. And there was an agreement from President Trump and the negotiators at the White House to say, okay, in the greater effort of getting more funding across the board for the federal government through, we will agree to separate out this Homeland Security funding, debate that later, push it out for a couple of weeks, which is how we ended up with this past Friday being that deadline. That was 2 weeks after the initial conversations about this. An agreement to continue that conversation, but in the interest of funding other parts of the government, let's go ahead and allow Congress to debate on those measures separately and then keep this Department of Homeland Security conversation until the end. We see this all the time in shutdowns. There's a phrase used often, kicking the can down the road, which is what a lot of it amounts to, an agreement to have another conversation in the effort of passing something that will at least fund the government in some part in that moment. So we are now in the future moment of the ramification of that conversation, of having agreed to split out Homeland Security funding in the interest of funding other agencies that are now good through this September 30th. So this is a part of that, but now we are seeing in this moment with the high levels of frustration on the Democratic side, and as you noted from Speaker Johnson on the Republican side, the attempt to say, well, this is Democrats' fault, why we're here, why do they want to make America less safe, essentially. That's the moment that we're in. And so potentially, hopefully, with Operation Enforcement ending in Minneapolis, that could bring the temperature down around these conversations. But at least from, as you note, from Hakeem Jeffries and other Democratic leaders, what we're not hearing is a ratcheting back of their rhetoric as well. And so that could portend in this next week when Congress isn't even around, so they can't vote on any potential deal that would be reached. But there could continue to be conversations and negotiations. So when members of Congress come back to the Capitol, maybe there will be a moment in that after a week has passed of being at home, hearing from their constituents, conversations continuing, maybe to come back to Washington and have some sort of agreement.
I want to talk a little bit about the workers that are going to be seeing these impacts, obviously with DHS, with TSA. Have unions representing these workers made any statements about this shutdown?
There have been some comments coming out to say, look, we support our workers. We understand that this is a political conversation, but in terms of wanting to see our members paid, to not have those paychecks delayed, that's an increasing point of frustration among the federal workforce and the unions that represent a lot of those employees. Let's not forget, it was just a year ago that a lot of these employees were dealing with DOGE and the different cuts that were coming out of that, the broad measures moving through the federal government to try to cut down on the size of it. And so we've been hearing a lot from these organizations over the past year, this first year of the second Trump administration, and seeing that they feel that their employees are continuing to be affected. So if this does drag on, if TSA workers are still showing up on the job but not getting paid, if they do miss paychecks, and if that goes on for a while, then that conversation will continue. And that's another point of pressure into the conversation, because these are this represents a very large sector of American employees, and they've been through a lot. And so I don't think that we're going to see a quieting of that conversation. If anything, it's going to get louder.
FEMA is another agency that is going to be seeing these impacts. Are there any active disaster responses right now that are going to be possibly delayed or uh, negatively impacted because of the shutdown?
We're not in a moment, thankfully, right now that we have been at some points in the past where a shutdown is coming, like when we had a massive winter storm and lingering summer storms for which the damage cleanup is still happening. We're not in that moment right now, but that doesn't mean it's not going to happen. I'm not trying to be fatalistic and warning and saying, oh no, that we're setting up for a horrible situation here. But that is something that FEMA is always being asked about. You know, this we see hurricanes come through. I live in South Carolina, and we're always in hurricane zone basically until the end of November, all through the summer. And when those storms do come through in areas like this and others, it's not just a moment where there has to be a response. That's a lingering situation. It goes on for a very long time afterward, even if the headlines drop and people aren't necessarily paying attention to it elsewhere. So it's kind of a situation where people are looking at FEMA and expecting them to always be ready for something. And that's exactly why they're there. But in this moment, when the funding starts to become a question and there are concerns about if the agency isn't necessarily ready were something to happen, that's always a concern. And we are starting to see that bubble up, particularly with the criticism that's come in lately of Homeland Security Secretary Noem, that she is also in charge of FEMA. And there are some who feel that they haven't seen enough of her when it comes to things like the recent winter storm that roiled a lot of parts of the country. There was a concern among some that they just weren't seeing enough from her because she was dealing with DHS and the situation in Minneapolis and so many other things. So it's a multi-tentacled situation for sure, but FEMA is a very important part of that.
Meg, we are in an election year. How is this shutdown going to impact, how may it impact public opinion as a lot of people are going to work to head toward the polls coming up in a few months?
Sure. Well, hopefully this situation with the current shutdown won't be prolonged. That's always the hope when we come into these sorts of conversations and moments of grinding to a halt for some pieces of the federal government. So hopefully that won't continue to drag on. But you're right that we are going to see voters starting when the early voting is already happening in some places. But in terms of the primaries that are going to really determine the cadence for those of us like me who cover politics year in and year out, that's really going to start ramping up in the beginning of March. And so if these conversations continue to happen, if there isn't something more sustained to really deal with funding for entities like Department of Homeland Security and all of the things under its huge umbrella, then that is going to provide a space for there to be political debate. It's certainly, this is going to come up. We are going to hear a lot about immigration enforcement actions from both major political parties throughout all of the political debate this year. I don't think that just even if there is a funding deal that really gets everything handled as soon as Congress comes back, the issue is not going to go away. But the more that this is prolonged and when there is a place for people who have disagreed on these issues to point to say, look, let's pretend it's the Democrats. We as Democrats believe so strongly that we wanted to bring more accountability into DHS that we were willing to go out on a political limb and do this, for you, our constituents. That's an argument that I think we're going to hear from quite a few people who are running for re-election and for election this fall. And on the part of Republicans, they'll have an opportunity to say, we are helping President Trump enforce his agenda, all of the things that he promised you as voters he would try to do in office. He is getting them done. And the only way that we as a Republican Party can get them done is by standing up for what you, the voters, have told us that you want. Now, another important thing to remember is we are seeing public opinion polling now that's coming in, having been done in the wake of the deaths that you mentioned of Renee Good and Alex Pretti. And some of what we're hearing is a little bit of doubt from even those within the Republican Party who consider themselves Republican voters to say, okay, well, maybe we're kind of tired of this and we really don't love the way that this has gone, and we are willing to maybe move on. Immigration was a huge winning issue for President Trump when he came back into the White House, and for Republicans writ large across the board. And now that some of the enforcement actions have really not been as well received all across the board holistically by Republicans, then that does provide another space for Democrats who are seeking to take control of Congress in this midterm election year to really try to make their argument as to, okay, well, if you overall you like immigration reform, but you don't love some of the specifics, then this shutdown will give Democrats an opportunity to point to where they really will argue that they've stood up for all of that for the voters.
Meg, I do just have one final question for you. What should the public be looking out for in terms of indicators so that they can gauge how serious this shutdown could become?
Like I said, hopefully it doesn't continue on and become something that we're still talking about in weeks and weeks. But for those of us like me who travel all the time in and out of airports, oftentimes in shutdowns, that's where we as Americans, not employees of the federal government, that's a lot of times where we see those direct impacts. Everyone will get paid after the funding measures are approved and put into place, but there could be missed paychecks for those TSA workers who are scanning us all through and ensuring that people who are traveling are who they say they are. And so the longer that these situations go on, we do often see a lot of absences among that workforce, and that we can still eventually get on our flights, but that can lead to delays and long lines and a lot of frustration, and travel is already tough. So for those of us who are out and about and trying to get to places, that could be somewhere that we're seeing impacts. It's really important to remember, and I try to include this in any reporting that I'm doing around shutdowns, is to note for people what's not affected. Unlike what we dealt with last fall in the 43-day record shutdown, this shutdown does not affect SNAP benefits. It does not affect food assistance programs. So that was a big piece that we did. We saw a lot of impact when people were missing those benefits and weren't able to access them. That's not part of this. And so I think equally as important as talking about what we are seeing is reiterating what we're not going to be seeing. There will certainly, if this does continue, be some effects, particularly for those of us who are traveling. But in terms of SNAP and the other government funded programs that people rely on every single day just to assist them and their families, that's not going to be something that we're seeing. And so I think that's just really important to remember.
Meg Kennard with the Associated Press, thank you so much for providing this in-depth analysis of what everyone should know about this current government shutdown. And of course, we are going to keep checking in with you to see how this all progresses.
Call me anytime. Always good to be with you.
All right, thanks. You take care.